Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 15, which is our final chapter in this course. And it deals with so-called environmental economics. So really all environmental economics is the economic analysis of, essentially, of pollution. Okay, so let's just move on. Okay, so when we talk about pollution, the economic analysis is based on this distinction between so-called private costs and social costs, and we saw that same distinction back in chapter. Geez, I want to say it's chapter 7. No, sorry, it's chapter 5. Chapter 5. Okay. And then kind of this quaint aspect of environmental economics. It's kind of a feature of economics that we find almost regardless of where economists apply their trade. Is we tend to have these optimal levels of these so-called social ills. So whether the problem is crime or drug use, illegal drug use, or pollution, there tends to be an optimal level of those social ills from an economic point of view. And so as we would expect, as we've come to expect in this course, the optimal level of pollution associated with a particular production activity is the quantity of production where the marginal benefit equals the associated marginal cost. So marginal revenue, marginal cost, same kind of thing. Anyways, so we'll see how this applies to pollution. And it seems to me we saw this already back in chapter 5, but what the heck. Okay. So pollution often arises due to the presence of so-called common resource property. And the absence of well-defined property rights. And one way we can try to reduce pollution is by defining those property rights and then giving them to parties and then enforcing them. Okay, and then the final little section that this book deals with are some what I call some citizen-level initiatives at reducing pollution. Even though they're not necessarily economical. Some of these pollution reduction activities we undertake, I think they're more of a feel-good initiative. It makes us feel good, even though there's probably not very good economics to them. Okay, and then finally, and it's not part of the book, it's not part of the course or anything, but I thought I'd give you a slightly different perspective of something else. So we all know that global warming is a bad thing, and global warming is caused by greenhouse gases, and they're a bad thing. We all know that because we're brainwashed to think that way. However, there is another view that actually global warming is a very positive thing, and I have some evidence to give you the other side of the coin there. So pollution might contain not only negative externalities, there can be some positive externalities there as well. Anyways, we'll get to that at the very end. Okay, so off we go to chapter 15 here. Okay, so we need to analyze pollution from an economic perspective. We need to draw this distinction between private costs and social costs. So private costs are so-called internal costs. So these are the costs of production that are incurred by the producer. And so the producer explicitly pays these production costs. You know, the producer of the product buys raw materials, hires employees, pays property taxes, pays rent, and so on. Those are all internal costs. However, we know that in some production processes, there can also be some other costs that the producer does not have to bear, and these are external costs. And when we combine the internal with the external costs, we arrive at what's known as the social cost, which is the full cost of resource usage. So pollution is a form of external cost because often the polluter does not pay all the associated costs of that pollution. So if we have a factory and they're spewing pollution into the air and people in the neighborhood are getting sick due to the air pollution, the private manufacturer probably is not paying the health costs of those sick people, and so it's society that bears those external costs. Okay, and so we say that pollution's a situation where social costs exceed private costs, and and just another good example of that is the vehicles we drive. The vehicles we drive, as long as they're based on carbon gasoline burning engines, we're spewing pollutants into the air, but I, the driver, don't bear the social cost associated with the vehicle that I drive. Other people are getting sick, not me. But of course, it probably works in reverse. I'm getting equally sick from other people's pollution as well. But anyways, okay, so we have this concept of social cost, which is the combined internal costs and external costs associated with production. Okay, so this little slide here, it's not exactly quite right. We're talking about pollution. We're talking about pollution. And what we mean is pollution is a so-called negative externality. And if we go back to chapter 5 on page 117 to 120, to 120, the book draws a distinction between negative externalities and positive externalities to the production process. So pollution is an example of a negative externality. There are additional costs that society bears in addition to the internal cost that the producer pays. And then sometimes there can be positive externalities. So these are benefits that accrue to society that the producer doesn't exclusively obtain. Okay, so a negative externality, it's a social cost to production that's higher than the private cost of production. So it's a cost that's external to the producer, and we call it pollution. So the social cost includes the cost to society of the resource consumption. So we've got our little diagram here, and we saw the same diagram. We saw the same diagram back in chapter 5. So if you don't kind of pick it up from here, you might want to go back to chapter 5. Okay, so this little diagram explains how pollution can arise. So here we have a product market. So this is an output market. This is an output market. I should just write that down. Output. And so we have a demand curve. And we have a supply curve for the producers. This is a producer supply curve. And so we recall from recent chapters that the supply curve is the marginal cost curve above shutdown point or above minimum average variable cost. So the industry has its own supply curve, and so in equilibrium, we have the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve. So we have this price for the product, and this is our quantity. But in this particular example, we have some external costs. So we have some pollution, and effectively what that means is that there are some additional costs And so we know from our straight supply and demand diagrams, this just always applies. So here's a demand curve, here's a supply curve. And we know that if the costs of the producer increase, that shifts the supply curve to the left. If the costs increase, production costs increase, so equilibrium quantity declines and equilibrium price increases. So when we talk about pollution, we mean there's some external costs that are borne by society. So at this level of production that the private sector produces, we see that the social cost is higher at this particular quantity. And if we factored in the external cost to the internal cost, then this societal supply curve is shifted to the left. So this means that from society's perspective, the optimal quantity of output is lower than from the private perspective, and the optimal price is higher. And how do we know that? So if the private sector makes the decisions concerning the quantity of product that should be produced, then we see that the marginal cost to society at this quantity one is greater than the marginal cost to the private sector. So societal costs are higher than private costs at Q1, and it's only when we use the societal supply curve that at equilibrium the societal marginal cost equals societal marginal benefit. And so what this really says is that if there are externalities to the production process, because private producers are not bearing all the costs associated with that production, then they overproduce. That's the bottom line, they overproduce. And if they were made to bear the full cost, then the private supply curve would equal the societal supply curve, and production would be lower and price would be higher. So if private producers do not bear the entire cost of production, both internal costs and external costs, then we have overproduction. We have overproduction of the product. And we have overproduction when the polluters don't pay. Okay, so how can society try to correct this overproduction that's resulting in this pollution? What can we do? What can we do? Okay, so we have 3 ways that society can try to correct for these externalities. 1, we can force the polluters to pay for polluting. And so if we force the polluters to pay, there's our demand curve, there's the original supply curve. If we force the polluters to pay, then the supply curve is going to shift to the left, and the optimal quantity is going to reduce, and the price is going to go up. So that's one way we can deal with these polluters. So this concept of taxes to pollute, they're not uncommon. So I have a couple of examples here. Let's just try to. I got some advanced slides. Let me try to show them to you. Okay, I got to clear that. Okay, so here's an example from Sweden. So sometimes we hear in the news, we hear about this talk about carbon taxes. So, we think that greenhouse gases are bad for us and bad for the environment. And so many jurisdictions around the world are trying to control the emissions from consuming fossil fuels. And so Sweden has a carbon tax to help reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And they have been successful. Although the carbon tax has cut emissions by an additional 20%, and it'll be enabling them to reach their so-called their Kyoto Protocol targets. Canada pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol a number of years ago. Anyway, so even though polluters were paying a higher price for emitting greenhouse gases, the country of Sweden was successful in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and people have been giving credit to this tax to encouraging industry to become more innovative in the uses of green technologies. Okay, and then I have another example here. This one's from British Columbia. You might not recall this. I recall this because I was living in British Columbia at the time. So BC a couple of years ago implemented a carbon tax on the price of gasoline, and I can't remember what. I think it's about 10 cents a liter. And so here's a bit of an analysis. I can't remember when that was implemented. It's like 2010 or something. Oh no, I guess it was 2008. Okay, so BC implemented this carbon tax on retail gasoline sales, and it's been successful. It has succeeded in reducing emissions in the province without reducing economic growth. So between July 1st, 2008 and 2012, so for a 4-year period, greenhouse gas emissions in BC fell 17.4%, and then they rose in the rest of the economy. And during that same period, BC's economy did better than the rest of Canada. So their economy wasn't necessarily hurt with this additional tax. Okay, I'm going to come back here in just a second, but okay, so that's one way that society can try to deal with, try to reduce, or trying to make the private sector pay the full costs of production. Levy a pollution tax, carbon tax, pollution tax. Depends on the kind of pollution. Okay, then another way is to force producers that build polluting equipment to have some pollution control equipment built into them. So we all know that the vehicles we drive have catalytic converters and mufflers and exhaust systems to try to scrub out some of the pollutants. And so there are regulations. The government imposes regulations on the automotive manufacturers to build in pollution control equipment in the vehicles. So that's method number 2. And then the third way is to create a system of tradable pollution permits. So what happens is we have some big industry. In fact, okay, I was going to say. Okay, anyways, so we have some big industry that's polluting. So what the government does is they give a certain pollution permit to each business and says, hey, you can only produce up to this pollution up to this level, and if you produce more than that level, you have to buy some of these permits from other parties. And if you don't use your little permit here, you're free to sell that to another business that might want to continue polluting. So we did have this kind of regime in Canada, in Quebec a couple of years ago. I actually don't know if it's still in effect today or not. Okay, and so the term that we hear for these kind of things in the news is a so-called cap and trade program. So Quebec had a cap and trade program, and it seems to me there's some American jurisdictions, I want to say it's California, that also have a cap and trade system for greenhouse gases. That's what GHG stands for. Anyway, so what happened in Quebec is you had some manufacturing companies that were emitting greenhouse gases, and the government wanted to reduce those greenhouse gases. So the government went around all these polluters and said, okay, you can pollute, but you can only pollute this much. Here's your permit setting how much, the quantity of pollution you're allowed. And the government said that we're going to make these quantities smaller and smaller as years go by. But in the meantime, you're welcome to pollute. And if you need to pollute more, you can buy some of these permits. That's the trade part. You can buy these permits. So the cap is the maximum quantity of pollution you're allowed. And then the trade part is if you want to pollute more, you have to go out and buy these permits from other polluters. And as I mentioned before, if you don't need to pollute that much, you're welcome to sell your permits to other parties so you can get money in return. Anyways, the purpose is to encourage companies to adopt greener or less polluting forms of production technology. Okay, so it's not just a theory. There are some jurisdictions around the world that actually use this stuff. Okay, let's just move on. Okay, so if we have taxes on pollution, or have some kind of cap and trade system in place to control pollution, the authors mention that it really makes sense to have. They don't quite use this term, but it really makes sense to have a location contingent system. Meaning, maybe you should be able to pollute more in communities where the cost is low, and pollute less in communities where the social cost is relatively high. And really, what that means is that it's not a good idea to have a uniform tax. It's not a good idea to have a single tax, a single pollution tax across the country, or a single tax within a province, because not everybody suffers the same social cost from the pollution. We can imagine that more people get ill from air pollution in big cities like Edmonton and Calgary because there's more people there. Whereas in rural Alberta, we have a whole lot fewer people to start with, and our communities are smaller, so the wind blows our pollution away. Whereas in the big cities, it probably hovers there and they get sick of it. So it really makes sense to have a location contingent system of pollution regulation. And so the way the law works in Canada, we effectively do have this location contingent system of pollution control, because in Canada, the regulation of pollution is regulated partially by the provinces and partially by the federal government. It's partially by the feds and partially by the provinces. So, and you know that some provinces are much more populous than others, some are more rural, some are more urban. So effectively, here's the feds have jurisdiction over, I don't know, pest control, fisheries, things adversely affecting the water, some environment things, some pollution in the environment, so they control some chemicals. I don't know what party substances are. They control some toxic substances, prohibited substances, restricted substances, hazardous wastes, and then the provinces and the provincial jurisdiction, they have control over air, drinking water, hazardous waste, ozone depleting substances, air, ozone, effluent discharge, air, ozone, water contaminants, hazardous waste. Anyway, so there's different jurisdictions. So effectively, we do have this location contingent system of pollution control in Canada, and so that's what the authors are recommending. Okay, and then Okay, and then we do have some, in addition to government methods of trying to control pollution, we also have some citizen level methods of controlling pollution. So we have these recycling approaches, reducing material usage, reusing materials, recycling materials, and recovering. I had to look up what recovering means. So the example from the book is recovering water from your roof when it rains and using that water to water your lawn or water your trees or wash your car, I guess. Anyways, so we do have some citizen level initiatives for reducing, controlling pollution. And we'll come back to these towards the very end of the chapter. So I'm just going to skip over them for the moment. Oh, okay. So we have this. Oops. Okay, so we're going to define pollution as an undesirable byproduct of an activity. And often when we think about pollution, we think of industrial pollution as air pollution and water pollution. However, there's all sorts of other forms of pollution. We don't have to be too creative to see some interesting examples here. So I have four examples of some somewhat unusual forms of pollution, although I suspect you've probably heard of or seen all of these yourself. But just before I go to those four examples, what we're going to see very shortly here is that pollution is an inevitable consequence of economic activity. And so in economic activity, we're producing products that we want to consume. So it's inevitable that we'll have some pollution, and we'll see very shortly that it's not even desirable to eliminate all pollution because it can be too costly to do that. But before we get to that, I'm just going to show you some examples of some non-traditional forms of pollution, so not just air and water pollution. We have, just a second here, whoops. We have noise pollution. And we've all seen, driving along major highways, we've all seen these noise barriers alongside highways to protect the residences living behind them from the noise of passing vehicles. And then another form of pollution that we don't hear about a whole lot, unless you happen to have certain kind of interests. But there is a form of pollution known as light pollution. And light pollution affects not only wildlife, but it can also affect people. So this is a bit of a map of areas of the world where we have noticeable forms of light pollution. And so, if you're green, yellow, or red, you have high levels of light pollution. And if you're towards the darker colors, then you have less. So we can see that even Alberta here has some noticeable light pollution. Oops. So here's Alberta. Here's Alberta. So as we would expect, high light pollution in the big cities, Fort Mac, Grand Prairie. Anyways, and obviously a whole lot less light pollution in the rural areas. So light pollution is detrimental to both wildlife and to humans. And I'm not an environmental economist, but it can disrupt birds. It can disrupt birds flying. And apparently there's quite a large number of birds that fly into buildings every year. They fly into them in the nighttime because they're attracted to the light. And anyways, they smack on the buildings and then they die. And I think there's millions of birds that die per year in North America. So it can confuse the migratory patterns of animals, change predator-prey relations, cause physiological harm. And there's another example that I don't have on the slide here, but apparently light pollution also interferes with turtle breeding. When you have turtles in the sea and they lay their eggs on the shore, and when the little turtles hatch, instinct pulls them to the water. And it's not just to the water, it's to the light given off by the moon. But if you have large urban centers nearby and the bright light is in the other direction, the little turtles, they go in the wrong direction. Of course, they die because there's no water over by that highway. Anyways, so and then light pollution can also adversely affect people as well. So it can affect their sleeping patterns. because it affects our production of melatonin, one of the hormones that governs our sleep. Anyways, it's not a big form of pollution, but it is recognized as a form of pollution. Oh, and of course, with light pollution, of course, it also affects astronomers, because if you have observatories in large centers, they can't see the stars. Anyways, okay, so what other forms of pollution do we have? Well, you've probably heard of this one. You've heard about these declining bee populations, and I believe that the exact cause of these collapses in bee colonies, I think there's multiple causes here. So it's not simply pollution. I think there's a number of other factors, but it has been recognized that pesticides may be one of the causes of the death of these, or the collapse of these bee colonies. So in Europe a couple of years ago, they implemented a ban on pesticides, and I can't even pronounce this word, neonicotinoids. It's used to control some kind of mites that affect bees, but the mites get immune to it, and it doesn't work. Anyways, but the bees get infected and the bees die. Anyways, so here's the form of pollution. Pesticides are designed to improve our crop yields, but here it's backfiring by apparently killing bees. Okay, and then the final form of pollution I have, example of pollution, is, and the book mentions this as well, is visual pollution. So this is all the ugly billboards that we see going into in urban communities. It's a kind of blight. I mean, often when we're driving down the highway and we come up to a nice little town, we want to see the nice mountains in the background, and we want to see the nice fields and lakes. But if you have all these billboards, it's visual pollution. And of course, we have several sources. It could be due to billboards, people storing their trash in the front yard, space debris. Well, I guess I don't know what that is. Spaceships falling from outer space, telephone towers, electric wires. This kind of ugly stuff. Okay. So let's just go back. So, as we mentioned before, in economics, we like to figure out what is the optimal quantity of pollution, because it's not necessarily desirable to get rid of all pollution. Okay, so economists like to calculate the optimal level of pollution. Let me just get blue here. And so the optimal level of pollution is the point where the marginal benefit from the productive activity equals the marginal cost of the pollution abatement. If we want to reduce pollution, there's a cost associated with that. So if we want vehicle manufacturers to have their vehicles spew less pollution in the air, we have to get them to put on more pollution control measures. So there's a cost of that technology. So in this little diagram here, so they're using air as the resource. And so on the x-axis we have degree of air cleanliness. So here we have perfectly clean air. This is perfectly clean air. And this is perfectly polluted air, or perfectly dirty air. So we have a marginal benefit from the production of this product. So as we produce more and more of the product, the marginal benefit declines, so the marginal benefit curve declines. And on the y-axis here, we have the marginal cost and marginal benefit of pollution abatement. So sorry, this is the marginal benefit is the benefit resulting from controlling the pollution. So if we have a very low level of pollution control, we're going to have a very high benefit associated with that. But as we try to reduce the pollutants in the air, and increase our air cleanliness, the marginal cost is going to increase. That's the red line here. And then the marginal benefit is going to decline. And then lo and behold, the two curves intersect at a point where the marginal benefit from reducing air pollution equals the marginal cost associated with the control of the pollution equal. And so this is the optimal quantity of pollution. This is zero pollution, so perfectly clean air is not desirable from an economic point of view, because the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit at zero pollution. So economists say there is an optimal level of pollution. That's what that little chart is telling us. And this is how economists analyze all these social ills, crime and drug use and prostitution, all that kind of stuff. There's an optimal level of these things, because trying to get rid of all of the social ill is simply going to be too costly to society. So we only try to reduce the ill to the point where the marginal benefit from that reduction equals the marginal cost of its removal. Okay. So it's just a common economic approach to social ills. Okay, so off we go to. Oops. Okay, so so why does pollution arise? Like, why do we have pollution in society? And there's a couple of factors here. Pollution often arises when we have something that's known as common. So the way these textbook writers call it, they call it common property. But some other parties call it common resource property, or some people call it common resource goods, and some people just call it resource property, or common resources. Anyways, so we have pollution arises when we have what's called common resource property and defined property rights. So we have a form of property known as common resource property. So what we need to do, we need to draw a distinction between private property and common resource property, and we'll come back to this in the course in macroeconomics. But when we talk about private property, we mean property that people own, and if you own something, that your right of ownership gives you the right to use it and to sell it or exchange or trade it with other parties. But common resource property is different, because it's owned. It's not owned by any individual person. Rather, it's owned by everybody. And this concept of public ownership of certain resources, namely air, water, and wildlife, it goes back to the time of the Romans. So it's not a modern concept by any means. It's not a modern concept by any means. So I have something here. It's very hard to read this, but I'm going to try to show it to you anyways. Okay, so the concept that air, water, fish are held in common, for use by all, was recognized by the Romans. So about 1,500 years ago, in 535 AD, under Roman law. What does it say? So under this Roman law, under the Justinian Code of 529 AD, by the law of nature, these things are common to mankind: air, running water, the sea, and consequently the shores of the sea. No one is forbidden to approach the seashore, provided he respects the habitats, monuments, buildings, etc. All rivers and ports are public. Hence, the right of fishing in a port or rivers is common to all men. So I mean, this is obviously 1,500 years old, and this is not exactly 100% true today, but the recognition that we have certain economic resources that are owned by everybody still prevails. The seashore extends as far as the greatest floodplain. The public use of the seashore is part of the law of nations, as is that of the sea itself, and therefore any person is at liberty to place on it a cottage, a retreat, dry his nets, haul them from the sea. Wild beasts, birds, fish, all animals which live either in the sea, the air, or the earth. As soon as somebody takes them, somebody captures them, they become the property of the captor. Anyways, the point is, some of these aspects of nature, it's a form of resource, it's a form of natural resource that is recognized to belong to everybody, and that's what common resource property is. And I have to admit, we'll come back to this in macro class. This book in this section doesn't do a particularly good job of describing the features of common resource property. Anyways, it's something that's quote unquote rivalrous, and non-excludable. I have a slide here. I'm going to try to show it to you just in case you're interested. So on this slide here, we have a classification of property, and it's a matrix. It's a matrix. It's a 2x2 matrix. So, you know, in this version, on the x-axis we have so-called rivalrous goods and non-rivalrous goods, and then on the y-axis we have so-called excludable goods and non-excludable goods. So I just want to point out three things here. One is we have something known as private goods. So private goods are goods that are both rivalrous and excludable. Rivalrous means only one person can consume the good at a time. So my classic example is a piece of pizza. If I'm eating the piece of pizza, you can't eat the piece of pizza because once I eat it, it's gone. But if the good that we're consuming is fireworks, or watching a display of the fireworks, I can watch the fireworks and you can watch the fireworks at the same time. My enjoyment of the fireworks does not detract from your enjoyment. Anyway, so this is what rivalrous means. It means only one person can consume at a time, whereas non-rivalrous means more than one person can consume at a time. And excludable means, does the person pay to use the goods or not? So when we talk about private goods, so this is like pizza, it's my car, it's the milk that I buy, it's the vehicle, the gasoline that I purchase for my vehicle. I'm the only person who uses it at a time, and I have to pay for it. But we have some other goods that are that we don't pay for explicitly to use. So, for example, the city has a park. I can walk in the park today, tomorrow, the next day, and I'm not paying. I might be a visitor to the town, and so I don't even pay any taxes in this particular town, and yet they give me this nice park that I'm free to walk in. So private goods are known as rivalrous and excludable. Public goods, so this is like parks, this is like fireworks put on by the town, are non-rivalrous, so more than one person can consume them at a time, and non-excludable means you don't have to pay for them. So then we have this other classification of goods. So this is known as common goods. So this is the common resource property, or the common property that this chapter is talking about. So common resource property, this is the air that we breathe, this is the water that we use, the lakes that we go fishing in. And the fish in these bodies of water, if I catch a fish in a lake, if I catch it, there's no more fish left. You can't catch the same fish unless I catch and release. But if I catch and keep a fish, you cannot catch it because it's no longer there. So fish in the sea or fish in the lakes are a rivalrous good, but it's also non-excludable because generally we don't have to pay to go fishing. I mean, yeah, you might have to get a fishing license, but to breathe the air or to swim in the lake, we don't have to pay to do that, and so they're non-excludable. So we have this other classification of goods, not private, not public, but they're common resource goods. These are the goods that are owned by everybody. It's just the way the Romans said 1,500 years ago. No person is excluded from catching these fish, or whatever they said. Okay, so we have these common resource properties. So this is property that's owned by everybody. So let's think of this as the air and the water. The air and the water. So when we have common property that it's owned by everybody, then no individual person has an incentive not to misuse it. We all know that there's only so many fish in that lake. If nobody owns it and we're all free to fish in the lake for free, then all the fish we could fish the lake out, and then there's no more fish left because nobody had an incentive to prevent overfishing. Whereas if I own the lake privately, then maybe I am concerned about how many fish I take out because I want a perpetual source of supply of fish. So I only take out a certain number of fish per year, and maybe I let other people catch fish as well, but I charge them so they don't. I charge them a fee so they don't drain the whole lake of fish. So the point is, pollution often arises when we have common resource property and property rights are not recognized. And so that gives us some potential solutions to controlling pollution. It gives us some potential solutions to controlling pollution. So one way is the way the authors refer to it. They refer to it as internalizing externalities via contracting. So if we have some pollution occurring, we can maybe try to control that pollution if we make the polluting party bear the cost of the pollution through the use of contracts. So there's kind of a fun example in the book of you have two neighbors, and they live on a hill. And these are houses. This is the hill, and this neighbor here, neighbor number A, has a nice view. It has a nice view of the lake. But this neighbor here has some trees that grow up, and if the trees grow up, they block the view of. So if neighbor number B lets his trees grow up, it blocks the views of neighbor number A. So effectively, these trees are a form of pollution. They're a form of visual pollution to household A here. So if party B owns this property and party A owns this property, then A might be able to get B to control his tree pollution by going to B and say, hey, Mr. B, let's enter into a contract here. I'll pay you $100 a year if you chop your trees off to this level, so I can enjoy my view. And if party B thinks that that's a fair deal, then party B will enter into the contract. He'll stop this visual pollution from party A, and party B makes money under this contract from party A. So we can sometimes. So in this case, we're internalizing the externality. This pollution cost is getting borne by party A here, but it's because the property rights are well defined. Party A can go to property B and say, hey, if I give you $100, will you chop down your trees? But if party B doesn't own the land, if party B is only a tenant, and the party B doesn't have the right to chop the trees down, then you can't control the pollution that way. But if the parties do have well-defined property rights, then we might be able to control this form of pollution by internalizing the costs through the use of voluntary agreements, otherwise known as contracts. Okay, so when you enter into contracts, there's a cost involved. There's a transaction cost. You know, they have a contract, so they have to go to a lawyer. They have to get it drawn up. The contract only runs for 3 years, and then they have to renegotiate it. Maybe the next time the guy pays $125 a year or whatever. So there's costs associated with trying to control pollution through voluntary contracts. And so this idea of controlling pollution through contracts, it's only workable when the transaction costs are relatively low. Because we can imagine another situation. Instead of talking about trees on one property blocking the view of another property owner, let's say party A was an astronomer, and he's got all these neighbors all throughout the neighborhood that are leaving their lights on at night, and they're emitting light pollution that impedes the ability of this astronomer to look at his to look at the stars. So conceivably, party A could go around to all these other neighbors and enter into contracts to get them to turn their lights off at night. Conceivably, he could do that, but because there's so many people involved here, the transaction costs are going to be high. You're going to have to enter into contracts, then you're going to have to monitor them, you have to pay all this money. It's probably easier to deal with one neighbor rather than many. Anyways, so if the transaction costs are high, then controlling pollution through voluntary agreements, through contracts, is likely not going to be practical. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so if we have some common resource property and ill-defined property rights, then we don't necessarily have a problem with pollution if people don't actually use the resources, or if there are enough resources so people can use it without any cost, without any external cost. However, if we have common resource property, we can encounter this pollution problem when people start finding a use for the resource, or there's a limited supply of the resource at zero cost. And if we do have this problem of pollution arising with common resource property, we have 3 possible solutions to dealing with the pollution. So one is, something tells me this doesn't quite match. I see. So there's three solutions. It's not on the slide actually. One is to assign property rights, assign property rights, and then let the owner control the property. So we have a lake, and nobody owns it, so everyone's fishing all the fish out of the lake. If we want that to get solved, we could sell the lake to somebody, and that way we're assigning property rights to the person. So this person now owns the lake, and now they control the access to fishing. And so if you control the property, now this owner can control how many people fish there at a time and how many fish are taken. So one way of dealing with pollution arising from common resource property is to recognize property rights by assigning them to a particular person. So another approach and this is the approach that's on the slide here. The next approach is to assign the property rights, assign property rights to the government, and let government regulate. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in just a sec, because we have three ways of government regulation, and then the third approach to controlling pollution with common resource property is to view the property rights. So recognize property rights, but B, recognize them as quote unquote sacred. And I have to admit, I don't even know what they're talking about here, but view them as sacred. That way, and so they're owned by somebody who's not an individual. And since we don't own the rights to the property, we don't have the right to pollute them. It belongs to someone else. Okay, so back to number 2 here is assigning the property rights to the government and then letting the government control the pollution through regulation. So we have 3 approaches to government regulation. So one is taxation. So this is the example of the carbon tax that we saw with British Columbia and Sweden. So we say, okay, government, effectively you own the air, and therefore you control the right of pollution by selling or by imposing carbon taxes. So another approach is through subsidization. So let's say somebody wants to use the resource, but they don't have enough money to use it. And so the government can give those parties money. They can subsidize the cost of using that resource to parties that can't afford it. And then the final approach is striatal regulation. So this is the pollution control equipment that goes into our vehicles, or encouraging people to use, encouraging the production of, let's say, green energy. If we don't want coal burning plants to produce electricity, the government encourages wind energy or solar energy. But as the book kind of mentions here, that even if the government regulates things in that way, in the example of green energy, not everybody wants these wind farms built in their backyard, and that's an example of what's known as NIMBY, which stands for not in my backyard. So yes, we think green energy is a good thing. Just don't build those big wind farms in my backyard. Okay, and then the very final section of this chapter deals with these 4 private sector approaches to dealing with pollution, which we mentioned before. So we can recycle. So recycling is a social initiative for conserving scarce resources. Let's just move this down. Oops, I'm at the end. Okay. So if we recycle, we're not using as much of the of natural resources. So we recycle paper, we recycle metals, we recycle plastic, and so if we recycle, then we're not putting as much strain on the natural resources that those raw materials came from. However, when we recycle, there's a cost to recycling. I kind of laugh at myself. I recycle paper, I recycle bottles and cans and plastic and all this kind of stuff. And I used to put all that stuff in my dishwasher, except for the newspaper, before I recycled it, so that when I put the stuff out for the recycling people to pick up, it was all nice and clean. And then I kind of realized that, well, this is kind of a waste, because it's just plastic and glass and metal. It's all going to get melted down anyways. Why am I wasting all this hot water to wash my garbage? Anyways, but if you're idiotic like me, you put out nice clean garbage for recycling, and there's a cost involved. Or even if I don't wash it, when the recycling people come around to pick it up, they're driving a truck that's spewing diesel fumes into the air, or I drive it across the town to bring it to the recycling place. I'm burning up gas to bring back my 3 bottles and 4 cans. I mean, there's a cost involved. And if the cost exceeds the benefit from the recycled products, and often it does, especially in rural areas, recycling, I think, is really just more of a feel-good initiative than a real, there's no economic benefit. There's an actual economic cost from recycling rather than a benefit. And then the authors here mentioned this urban issue of landfill sites. Often we hear in the news that cities are running out of landfill sites, and therefore we should recycle more and more so we don't have to use up some more landfill sites. But this issue of scarce landfill sites, it's more of an issue in large urban centers than in rural centers. Because in rural places we have lots of room for landfills, but in a big city, Edmonton, Calgary, or Toronto, or Chicago, or someplace like that, you have so many people around, you probably just don't have, so far from the city center to go to the landfill site that you probably do have a scarcity of potential landfill sites. But in rural areas, potential landfill sites are not so scarce. And so recycling for the purpose of saving landfill sites probably does make sense in large urban centers, but not in rural ones. It's probably a waste. Recycling is probably a waste of time in rural centers, like Slide Bike. And I think that's true, actually, but anyways. Okay, that's my hunch. Okay, so the author's final comment here is saying, we recycle because we're afraid of running out of resources, because we think there's a scarcity of petroleum and water and metals and whatnot. But the authors actually have an argument here that we're not running out of resources. They're not so scarce. And in the book, in page 387, I don't know if they have actual data there, or they just say it, but they talk about declining prices for commodities over the last several decades. Oh, there's no chart. Okay, so the fact that commodity prices have been coming down over the last few decades tells us that the resources have not been getting any scarcer. If the resources were getting scarcer, we would think that their price would go up. But the fact that the prices are coming down tells us that they're not as scarce as we might think. Okay, so I have some examples of some of these declining resource prices, just so you can kind of see what the author is talking about. Whoops. So, okay. So here's an example of the declining. Declining food prices over the last 40, 50 years. So we can just eyeball this and we can see that there's been a downward trend in price of food. So it doesn't look like food is a scarce resource. Oops. And then I got some other commodities here. So here we have price charts going back about 150 years, 160 years. So some grain prices, corn, rice, and wheat. Of course, the chart fluctuates around, but we can see that there's this long-term downward trend. So again, it doesn't look like food is a scarce resource, or that really represents the cost of land. It doesn't look like there's a scarce resource there. And here's some other commodities. So palm oil, rubber, and sugar. Again, if you go back over 150 years, it seems to be a bit of a downward trend there, just to the naked eye. This one's a little bit harder. This one's a little bit harder to see. So cocoa, coffee, and cotton. Well, the trend might not go back a full 150 years, but certainly seems like over the last 100 years, there's been a downward trend in the price of these three commodities. So again, doesn't look like we're running out of those guys either. Okay, so what do we have here? Tea tobacco and wool. Again, even if you just go back 100 years, it definitely looks like there's been a downward trend there, so it doesn't look like we're running into any of those resources. Okay, so now we have some metals, so aluminum, copper, and lead. So again, I guess if you go back the whole time period, it looks in general, there has been a downward trend as well. I guess aluminum's a relatively new invention, so it doesn't go back 150 years. Okay. So that's it for chapter 15, and that's actually it for the course. But I have one final thing. Since you're here, I'll just give you one little thing. We tend to think that pollution is a bad thing, and so now I'm going to show you how pollution is actually a good thing. But of course, we shouldn't call it pollution, because if it's a benefit, it's a positive externality rather than a negative one. Anyways, so we all know that global warming and greenhouse gases are bad, because that's what we're fed. That's what our media tells us about all the time. And we know that global warming is bad for planet Earth. I mean, this is what we're told, right? So here's a little chart that has confirmed that, sure enough, over the last 50 years, the world has confirmed global warming. If the color on the globe here is orangish red, we're experiencing global warming. So this is coming from the National Geographic, so I think they're a credible source. So it looks like in most parts of the world, at least certainly in the northern hemisphere, it's been getting warmer, and maybe around Antarctica there, some of it's getting colder. But anyways, so we have global warming. What causes global warming? Often it's caused by greenhouse gases. And so here's some of the detrimental aspects, some of the negative aspects of global warming. Ice is melting, especially at the poles of the Earth. Fewer Adelaide penguins in Antarctica, their numbers falling. Sea levels are rising because ice is melting. Some butterflies, foxes, and alpine plants have moved farther north. I don't know what's wrong with that. Precipitation has increased around the globe. I don't know if that's good or bad. Spruce bark beetles have killed a whole bunch of trees in Alaska. This also happened in British Columbia, and it's also occurring in Alberta as well. And it's true. It's caused by global warming. It is true. Because the only thing that kills those beetles are -40 for 2 weeks in a row, or forest fires. Okay, so what are some other bad things caused by global warming? Sea levels are rising, going to rise between 7 and 23 inches by the end of the century. I guess that's the current century. Hurricanes, thunderstorms are going to get stronger. Species that depend on one another are out of sync. Floods and droughts are becoming more common. Floods and droughts must be in different areas. More rain in Ethiopia. Less fresh water because the ice caps are melting. Ecosystems are going to change. This is all bad stuff. So now I have some good news about global warming, and we'll come back to this more in macroeconomics term next year. But the other side of the coin is that global warming is actually positive for standards of living around the world. And I'm just gonna jump right to the conclusion here. So here's some charts that correlates level of CO2 emissions. So these are greenhouse gases, right? And so this first chart shows how life expectancy in the world has changed with global warming. So here's our CO2 emissions increasing here. This is the last 50 years, and lo and behold, guess what's happening? People are living longer. Here we have real GDP per capita. So we haven't talked about GDP in this course, but we will in macroeconomics next term. So real GDP per capita is effectively the amount of income we earn per person per year. And what our little chart here is showing is that over the last 50, 60 years, as CO2 emissions have increased, the world is getting wealthier. So the world is getting wealthier, therefore less poverty. And of course, population is going up as well. So despite the fact that global CO2 emissions, greenhouse gases have a negative aspect on the world's atmosphere, melting polar ice caps, getting warmer, all that kind of stuff. There's also been a beneficial economic aspect. And this, I'm not showing you the whole article here, but greenhouse gas emissions are really quite good for vegetation. Vegetation is growing like no tomorrow around the world, caused by CO2, or contributed to by CO2. Anyways, that's it for chapter 15. That's it for the course. That's it for this week. So that's it. That's it. We'll see you next course.